Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest corners. Tonight we're trading Roman sandals for radioactive snow, swapping gladius wounds for cellular destruction, and exploring what happens when fishermen accidentally sail into humanity's most spectacular miscalculation. We're talking about the lucky dragon number 5 and the 23 men who went out to catch tuna and came back dying of radiation poisoning instead. So before we dive into this absolutely delightful tale of nuclear incompetence, hit that like button if you're ready to feel existential dread about atomic weapons, and subscribe if you enjoy stories about ordinary people getting absolutely wrecked by extraordinary stupidity. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always wild to see how global our little community of history masochists really is. Now settle in. Maybe grab something caffeinated, because this one's a journey. And let's talk about what happens when the United States decides to test a hydrogen bomb that's 3 times more powerful than they calculated in an ocean full of innocent fishermen who just wanted to make a living. So you think nuclear testing is precise and controlled? That's adorable. Really. Like thinking you can contain the sun in a mason jar. Picture this, you're a fisherman. Not the romantic, Hemingway-esque kind who battles marlin and contemplates existence. No, you're the practical kind who gets up at 3 in the morning, because fish don't care about your sleep schedule, and neither does your empty wallet. You've got calloused hands, a boat that's held together by prayer and marine-grade duct tape, and the unshakable belief that today might be the day you actually make enough money to fix that leak in your roof. Your name is Eikichi Kobayama, and you're the radio operator aboard the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, which translates to Lucky Dragon number 5. Lucky. Remember that word. You'll want to laugh about it later, assuming you survive long enough to develop a sense of cosmic irony about naming conventions. It's March 1st, 1954. The world is still figuring out what to do with all these shiny new nuclear toys that everyone's been building since someone had the brilliant idea to split atoms like firewood. You don't know this, of course. You're concerned with more pressing matters, like whether the radio's going to work today, and if the engine will make that grinding noise that means expensive repairs. The Lucky Dragon is a tuna fishing vessel, 140 feet of wood, rust, and stubborn determination. She's not pretty, but she's yours for the duration of this fishing expedition, and she's taken you and 22 other souls far from the coast of Japan into the vast blue nothing of the Pacific Ocean. You're out here because this is where the fish are, and fish are money, and money is survival. The crew isn't thinking about politics or international relations or the growing tension between nuclear powers. They're thinking about tonnage and market prices, and whether their wives remembered to pack enough rice for the journey. These are practical men with practical concerns, the kind who measure their lives in catches and seasons, not in headlines or history books. But history, as it turns out, doesn't ask permission before it decides to use you as a footnote. The United States, in its infinite wisdom and complete disregard for international maritime law, has decided that a lovely stretch of Pacific Ocean would make an excellent testing ground for their latest nuclear creation. They call it Castle Bravo, and it's designed to be big, really big, bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, which should have been a hint that maybe, just maybe, they should check their math and their safety perimeters. But here's the thing about nuclear weapons, they're not like regular explosions. You can't just light the fuse, step back, and hope for the best. These things operate on principles that would make Einstein weep and physics professors reach for stronger coffee. When you split atoms, you're not just making a big boom. You're rewriting the fundamental rules of matter and energy, and sometimes those rules have very nasty side effects. The test site is Bikini Atoll, a beautiful collection of coral islands that had the misfortune of being located in the middle of nowhere, which made it perfect for dropping experimental weapons of mass destruction. The native inhabitants were relocated, of course, because that's what you do when you need to turn someone's home into ground zero for the apocalypse. Just pack up your entire culture and move along, folks. Science calls. The Americans established what they called a safety zone. Imagine drawing a circle on a map and saying, "Nothing bad will happen outside this circle." The circle was supposed to be big enough to contain all the nasty radioactive particles that would be generated by the explosion. It was calculated by very smart people with very impressive degrees who were absolutely, catastrophically wrong. You see, Castle Bravo wasn't just big, it was 15 megatons of pure, concentrated sunlight brought down to Earth level. To put that in perspective, it was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. The fireball alone was 4.5 miles across. The mushroom cloud reached 130,000 feet into the sky. If you could see it from space, which some satellites did, it looked like God's own cigarette lighter had just flicked on. But you don't know any of this yet. You're just a fisherman, remember. You're out here doing what fishermen do fishing. It's about 6 in the morning on March 1st, and you're roughly 80 miles east of Bikini Atoll. You're outside the safety zone, technically speaking, which should mean you're safe. Should being the operative phrase. The Lucky Dragon is bobbing peacefully on the swells, her engines quiet, her crew preparing for another day of hauling nets and sorting fish. Some of the men are already up, checking equipment and scanning the horizon for signs of tuna schools. The ocean is calm, the sky is clear, and everything seems perfectly normal right up until the moment when the western horizon suddenly turns into the surface of the sun. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Castle Bravo detonates. First, there's the flash, not just bright, but impossibly bright. The kind of light that burns through your closed eyelids and etches itself permanently onto your retinas. It's brighter than looking directly into the sun through a magnifying glass while standing on a mirror. Men who are looking in that direction are instantly blinded, not temporarily, but with the kind of retinal damage that leaves permanent spots dancing in your vision. Then comes the heat. Even at 80 miles away, the thermal pulse hits like opening an oven door, except the oven is the size of a small city and running at about 6,000 degrees Celsius. The air temperature jumps 50 degrees in seconds. Paint starts to blister on the ship's superstructure. Men's exposed skin turns red like they've been sitting too close to a campfire. Except this campfire has the energy output of several million tons of TNT. The light show lasts for what feels like hours, but is actually only a few minutes. A false dawn spreads across the sky, turning the ocean into a sheet of molten copper. The horizon disappears in a wall of fire that reaches up to touch the clouds. It's beautiful in the way that tornadoes and volcanic eruptions are beautiful, terrifying, awesome in the biblical sense, completely beyond human scale. You grab your radio equipment, trying to raise someone, anyone, who might be able to explain what just happened. But the electromagnetic pulse from the explosion has fried every piece of electronic equipment within a 100-mile radius. Your radio is now an expensive paperweight. The ship's compass spins wildly before settling on magnetic north plus or minus wherever the hell it feels like pointing. The crew gathers on deck, staring at the mushroom cloud that's still growing on the western horizon. It looks like a massive grey and black cauliflower made of smoke and death, climbing higher and higher until it flattens out against the stratosphere like an umbrella made of fallout. Some of the men are taking pictures with small cameras, because even in the face of obvious disaster, humans have an irrepressible urge to document their own destruction. Captain Hisakichi Tsutsui, a man who spent 30 years reading weather patterns and ocean conditions, knows that whatever just happened, it's bad news for everyone in the vicinity. He orders the engine started and the course set for home. The Lucky Dragon turns east, her crew hauling in their fishing lines and securing everything that can be secured. But here's where the situation goes from bad to catastrophically worse. The explosion was much bigger than anyone had calculated. The scientists had expected a yield of about 5 megatons. What they got was 15 megatons, which means their safety calculations were off by a factor of 3. The fallout zone, instead of being contained within their carefully drawn circle on the map, extended far beyond anything they had planned for. And now, roughly 3 hours after detonation, that fallout is beginning to fall out of the sky. It starts as what looks like snow. Beautiful, pristine white flakes drifting down from the clear blue sky, landing on the deck of the Lucky Dragon like some kind of bizarre tropical blizzard. The crew, who have never seen snow, think it's ash from the explosion. Some of them reach out to catch the flakes in their hands, curious about this strange precipitation. It's not snow. It's not ash. It's pulverized coral, sand, and seawater that was sucked up into the nuclear fireball, irradiated with more radioactive isotopes than a medical textbook, and then spread across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean by high-altitude winds. Every single flake is loaded with enough radiation to kill a man, given sufficient exposure. The snow continues to fall for hours. It accumulates on the deck, on the rigging, on the fishing nets, and most importantly, on the crew. Men brush it off their clothes without thinking about it. Some taste it, finding it salty and gritty. It gets in their hair, under their fingernails, in their food, and in the freshwater tanks. By the time someone realizes that mysterious white powder falling from the sky after a nuclear explosion might not be entirely safe, the damage is already done. The crew has been exposed to levels of radiation that would make a Geiger counter sound like a machine gun. Their skin has absorbed radioactive particles. Their lungs have inhaled radioactive dust. Their digestive systems are processing radioactive material. They don't know this yet, of course. Radiation is invisible, odorless, and tasteless. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It just quietly goes about the business of destroying your cells from the inside out, breaking down the molecular machinery that keeps you alive and replacing it with chaos. The Lucky Dragon continues eastward, her crew increasingly sick, but still not understanding why. Some men complain of nausea and headaches. Others develop skin rashes that look like severe sunburn. A few start vomiting, which they initially blame on spoiled food or rough seas. You, as the radio operator, are particularly unfortunate. Your position requires you to spend long hours on deck, maintaining equipment that's been contaminated by fallout. You handle radioactive cables, adjust radioactive antennas, and breathe radioactive air for days on end. By the time the ship reaches Japanese waters 2 weeks later, you're already showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. The symptoms start small: fatigue that you can't shake off with sleep, a persistent low-grade fever that makes you feel like you're coming down with the flu. Your appetite disappears, and even the smell of food makes you nauseated. You tell yourself it's seasickness, or stress, or too much time in the sun. But then your hair starts falling out in clumps. Your gums begin to bleed when you brush your teeth. Dark bruises appear on your skin without any corresponding injuries. These are not the symptoms of seasickness or sun exposure. These are the symptoms of radiation poisoning, and they're getting worse every day. The Lucky Dragon limps into Yaizu port on March 14th, 13 days after the explosion. The crew is sick, the catch is contaminated, and the ship itself is so radioactive that Geiger counters start clicking from 50 feet away. Japanese authorities, who have some experience with radiation from less pleasant circumstances, immediately quarantine the vessel and rush the crew to hospitals. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because it's not just about 23 fishermen who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fallout from Castle Bravo didn't discriminate. It contaminated fish across thousands of square miles of ocean. It irradiated countless other fishing vessels. It turned the Pacific Ocean into a radioactive soup that would take decades to fully dilute. The tuna that the Lucky Dragon caught and the hundreds of other vessels that were fishing in the area carried radioactive isotopes in their flesh. These fish were sold in markets across Japan, consumed by families who had no idea they were eating fallout for dinner. The contamination spread through the food chain, from plankton to small fish to large fish to humans, creating a web of radioactive poisoning that extended far beyond the original blast zone. You, Aikichi Kaboyoma, spend the next 6 months in and out of hospitals, undergoing treatments that are barely better than the medieval practice of bloodletting. Doctors try everything they can think of: blood transfusions, bone marrow transplants, experimental medications that are sometimes more dangerous than the radiation itself. Nothing works particularly well, because radiation sickness isn't really a disease that can be cured. It's cellular damage that has to be healed by your body's own repair mechanisms, and sometimes those mechanisms are too damaged to function. The other crew members fare slightly better, mainly because they weren't exposed to as much direct contact with contaminated equipment. But better is relative. Several develop cancer within the next few years. Others suffer from chronic health problems that will plague them for the rest of their lives. A few recover almost completely, but they're the lucky ones, and luck in this case is purely a matter of how much radioactive dust happened to land on which part of their bodies. The international implications are staggering. Japan, which has some understandable sensitivity about being on the receiving end of American nuclear weapons, is not amused by having its citizens irradiated by what amounts to an industrial accident with geopolitical consequences. The incident creates a diplomatic crisis, strains the US-Japan relationship, and contributes to growing international concern about nuclear testing. The Americans, for their part, are embarrassed and defensive. They had assured the world that their safety precautions were adequate, that their calculations were correct, and that no one outside the designated test zone would be harmed. The fact that they were catastrophically wrong about all of these things is not something they're eager to advertise. Official statements are issued. Apologies are made. Compensation is negotiated, but none of this helps you very much because by September 1954, you're dead. Acute radiation syndrome, complicated by secondary infections and liver dysfunction. You're 23 years old, which means you've lived about as many years as there were crew members on your ship. Your death certificate lists the cause as acute radiation syndrome due to exposure to radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing. You're probably the first person in history to have that particular phrase on their death certificate, which is the kind of historical distinction that no one really wants. The other crew members attend your funeral, those who are well enough to travel. Some are still in hospitals. Others are dealing with their own health problems. All of them are grappling with the realization that they were used as unwitting test subjects in someone else's experiment with weapons of mass destruction. The Lucky Dragon herself becomes a museum exhibit, a reminder of what happens when nuclear powers conduct atmospheric testing without adequate safety precautions. She sits in a building in Tokyo, her hull still faintly radioactive decades later, a testament to the long-term consequences of splitting atoms in the middle of the ocean. But the story doesn't end with your death, because radiation has a very long half-life, and so do the consequences of exposure to it. The other crew members go on with their lives, or try to. Some return to fishing, though they're never quite comfortable eating their own catch. Others find work on land, unable to stomach the thought of spending months at sea, where mysterious white snow might fall from a clear blue sky. A few become activists, speaking out against nuclear testing and weapons proliferation. Their children and grandchildren grow up hearing stories about the day the sun rose in the west and snow fell from summer skies. Some of these children develop health problems that might or might not be related to their father's radiation exposure. Genetic damage from radiation can be passed down through generations, creating a legacy of cellular chaos that echoes through family lines like a curse written in DNA. The fish populations in the Pacific slowly recover from the contamination, though recover might be too strong a word. Marine life has a remarkable ability to adapt to environmental changes, including changes that would kill humans outright. But adaptation isn't the same as being unaffected. Fish caught in the fallout zone for years after the test showed elevated levels of radioactive isotopes in their tissues. The coral reefs around Bikini Atoll, ground zero for the explosion, are transformed into something that looks more like the surface of an alien planet than a tropical paradise. The intense heat and radiation sterilize the area, killing everything from microscopic plankton to large fish. It takes decades for life to return, and when it does, it's different from what was there before. Meanwhile, the United States continues its nuclear testing program, though with somewhat better attention to safety precautions and somewhat larger exclusion zones. The Castle Bravo incident serves as an expensive lesson in the importance of getting your calculations right when dealing with weapons that can literally reshape geography. Other countries take note and begin developing their own nuclear arsenals, because apparently the lesson learned from accidentally irradiating Japanese fishermen is not, maybe we shouldn't build these things, but rather, maybe we should build bigger and better versions of these things. The nuclear arms race accelerates, with each new weapon more powerful and more sophisticated than the last. The scientific community, meanwhile, begins to grapple with the ethical implications of their work. Many of the physicists who worked on nuclear weapons during World War II had convinced themselves that they were racing against Nazi Germany to develop the bomb first. But by 1954, Germany was defeated, and the justification for building ever larger weapons of mass destruction was becoming harder to defend. Some scientists become advocates for nuclear disarmament, arguing that weapons capable of destroying entire cities, or in the case of hydrogen bombs like Castle Bravo, entire regions, represent an unacceptable threat to human survival. Others continue their work, convinced that deterrence through overwhelming firepower is the key to preventing nuclear war. The fallout from Castle Bravo, both literal and figurative, spreads far beyond the Pacific Ocean. Anti-nuclear movements gain momentum in Japan and other countries. International treaties are negotiated to limit atmospheric testing. Public awareness of radiation hazards increases, though slowly and often in response to additional accidents and incidents. The medical understanding of radiation effects improves as doctors study the Lucky Dragon crew and other radiation exposure victims. New treatments are developed, though they remain largely ineffective against acute radiation syndrome. Cancer research advances, partly driven by the need to understand and treat radiation-induced malignancies. Environmental monitoring systems are established to track radioactive contamination in food, water, and air. These systems reveal the global extent of fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing, which turns out to be far greater than anyone had initially realized. Radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests are detected in everything from milk to human bone tissue, creating a baseline level of artificial radioactivity that becomes part of the modern world. The psychological impact of nuclear weapons testing extends far beyond those directly exposed to fallout. The realization that humans have developed the capability to poison the entire planet with radioactive contamination creates a new kind of existential anxiety. Children grow up with the knowledge that somewhere in the world, people are exploding bombs so powerful they can be seen from space, and so dirty they can contaminate fish thousands of miles away. Popular culture reflects this anxiety through movies, books, and songs about nuclear war and radiation poisoning. Science fiction stories explore scenarios in which radiation transforms humans into monsters or reduces civilization to rubble. The imagery of mushroom clouds and fallout shelters becomes part of the collective unconscious, symbols of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Lucky Dragon incident is the way it humanizes the abstract concept of nuclear warfare. It's one thing to talk about megatons and blast radii and strategic deterrence. It's another thing entirely to contemplate the story of Akichi Kuboyama, a young man who went to sea to catch fish and came home dying of radiation poisoning. Your story, and the stories of your 22 crewmates, serve as a reminder that nuclear weapons don't just threaten military targets or strategic installations. They threaten fishermen and farmers, children and grandparents, anyone who happens to be in the wrong place when someone decides to test their latest doomsday device. The radioactive snow that fell on the Lucky Dragon's deck didn't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between enemy agents and innocent bystanders. It fell on everyone equally, contaminating everything it touched with an invisible poison that would continue killing for months or years afterward. This is the true horror of nuclear weapons. Not just their immediate destructive power, which is admittedly impressive in a terrifying way, but their ability to turn ordinary environmental elements, air, water, soil, food, into instruments of slow death. A nuclear explosion doesn't just destroy buildings and kill people in the immediate blast zone. It renders entire regions uninhabitable, poisons food chains, and creates radioactive contamination that can persist for decades or centuries. The Castle Bravo test was intended as a demonstration of American nuclear capabilities, a message to potential enemies about the consequences of challenging US interests. Instead, it became a demonstration of the fundamental impossibility of controlling nuclear weapons once they're detonated. The fallout didn't respect national boundaries or political alliances. It didn't target military installations or strategic resources. It simply spread wherever the wind took it, contaminating everything in its path. The scientists who designed Castle Bravo were brilliant people with good intentions. They wanted to protect their country and end conflicts through superior firepower. but their brilliance was insufficient to predict or control the consequences of their creation. Nuclear weapons operate on such a scale, with such complexity, that even experts with decades of experience can miscalculate yields by factors of 2 or 3. When you're dealing with weapons that can level cities, a miscalculation by a factor of 3 isn't just an academic error. It's the difference between a contained test and an international incident. It's the difference between theoretical fallout patterns and actual human casualties. It's the difference between a successful demonstration of military might and an accidental war crime. The crew of the Lucky Dragon became victims of this miscalculation, unwilling participants in an experiment they never consented to join. They went to sea to catch fish and found themselves catching radioactive fallout instead. They returned home with holds full of contaminated tuna and bodies full of isotopes that would slowly destroy them from the inside out. Your death, Akichi Kobayama, was not quick or painless. Radiation sickness is a particularly cruel way to die because it gives you plenty of time to understand what's happening to you. Your cells stop dividing properly. Your immune system fails. Your digestive system shuts down. You waste away slowly, conscious and aware, while doctors try treatments that are largely experimental and often unsuccessful. The medical staff who treated you were learning as they went, because acute radiation syndrome was still a relatively new phenomenon in 1954. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had provided some clinical data, but most of the victims of those attacks had died quickly from blast effects or thermal burns. The Lucky Dragon crew represented one of the first opportunities for doctors to study and treat acute radiation syndrome in a controlled hospital environment. You became a case study, a learning opportunity for medical science. Your symptoms were documented, your treatments were recorded, your progress was measured and analyzed. In death, you contributed to medical knowledge that would eventually help other radiation exposure victims. Though this was probably small comfort to you, as you lay dying in a hospital bed in Tokyo, the compensation negotiated between the US and Japanese governments was intended to cover medical expenses and provide some financial support for your families, but no amount of money can truly compensate for radiation poisoning or premature death. The financial settlements were more about diplomatic relations and legal liability than about justice or adequate recompense for suffering. Your widow received a payment from the American government, along with an apology for the regrettable incident that cost you your life. The other crew members and their families received smaller amounts, proportional to their exposure and health problems. The money helped with medical bills and living expenses, but it couldn't restore health or reverse genetic damage or bring back the dead. The Lucky Dragon incident also highlighted the global nature of nuclear contamination. Radioactive fallout doesn't recognize national sovereignty or respect international law. When you explode a nuclear weapon anywhere on Earth, the consequences can spread far beyond your intended target zone. This makes nuclear weapons inherently different from conventional weapons, which generally affect only the area where they're used. The Pacific Ocean, being connected to all other oceans, carried radioactive contamination from Bikini Atoll around the world. Fish migrated through contaminated waters, spreading isotopes throughout marine food chains. Ocean currents distributed radioactive seawater across vast distances. Atmospheric circulation carried radioactive particles to distant continents. Within months of the Castle Bravo test, trace amounts of fallout were detected in rainwater as far away as Europe and Australia. The levels were generally too low to cause immediate health effects, but they represented a global increase in background radiation that would persist for years. Every nuclear test, everywhere in the world, contributed to this growing baseline of artificial radioactivity. Environmental scientists began to understand that the Earth's air and water systems were interconnected in ways that made localized nuclear testing impossible. You couldn't explode a bomb in the Pacific without affecting the Atlantic. You couldn't contaminate the Northern Hemisphere without eventually affecting the Southern Hemisphere. Nuclear weapons were revealed to be inherently global threats, regardless of where they were used. This realization contributed to growing international pressure for nuclear test ban treaties. If every nuclear test anywhere affected everyone everywhere, then everyone everywhere had a legitimate interest in limiting nuclear testing. The Lucky Dragon incident provided concrete evidence of transboundary nuclear contamination, making abstract arguments about global fallout patterns suddenly very real and personal. The fishing industry, meanwhile, struggled with contamination issues for years after Castle Bravo. Fish caught in the Pacific had to be tested for radioactivity before they could be sold. Markets developed radiation detection systems to screen seafood for contamination. Consumers became wary of Pacific fish, affecting prices and demand throughout the industry. Some fishing vessels avoided certain areas of the Pacific altogether, even when those areas were officially declared safe. The definition of safe when dealing with radioactive contamination is somewhat subjective and depends heavily on acceptable risk levels, which vary considerably between government agencies, scientific organizations, and individual fishermen who have to make a living in potentially contaminated waters. The Lucky Dragon's catch was, of course, completely unsaleable. Hundreds of tons of tuna had to be buried as radioactive waste, representing a total financial loss for the fishing company that owned the vessel. Insurance companies, faced with claims for radiation-contaminated cargo, began writing exclusion clauses for nuclear-related damages into their policies. Other fishing vessels that had been working in the same general area faced similar problems. Some had catches that were only slightly contaminated and might have been safe to eat, but the public was understandably reluctant to consume fish that was only probably not radioactive. The mere possibility of contamination was enough to destroy market confidence and render entire catches worthless. The economic ripple effects extended throughout the Japanese fishing industry and into international seafood markets. Fish prices fluctuated wildly as supply chains were disrupted and consumer confidence plummeted. Fishing communities that depended on Pacific catches faced unemployment and economic hardship through no fault of their own. Meanwhile, marine biologists began studying the long-term effects of nuclear contamination on ocean ecosystems. They discovered that different species absorbed and concentrated radioactive isotopes at different rates, creating complex patterns of contamination throughout food webs. Some fish species proved to be remarkably resistant to radiation, while others suffered population declines or genetic abnormalities. Coral reefs near the test site were particularly hard hit, because corals are sensitive to environmental changes and because they're fixed in place and can't migrate away from contaminated areas. The reefs around Bikini Atoll were essentially sterilized by the Castle Bravo blast, creating underwater wastelands that would take decades to recover. The recovery process itself became a subject of scientific study, as researchers tracked how marine life gradually recolonized the devastated areas. They found that some species returned quickly, while others were absent for years or never returned at all. The ecosystems that eventually developed were different from those that had existed before the bombing, representing a kind of evolutionary reset button pressed by nuclear weapons. Seabirds that fed on contaminated fish carried radioactive isotopes in their tissues and spread contamination to their nesting areas, sometimes on islands thousands of miles from the test site. This created secondary contamination zones that were completely unexpected and difficult to predict or monitor. The migratory patterns of marine animals meant that contamination could appear in unexpected places at unexpected times. Fish that were exposed to fallout in one area of the ocean might not show symptoms until they reached completely different waters weeks or months later. Tracking these patterns required international cooperation and long-term monitoring systems that were still being developed in the 1950s. Scientific understanding of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, the processes by which contaminants become concentrated as they move up food chains, was still primitive in 1954. The Lucky Dragon incident provided valuable but tragic data about how radioactive isotopes behave in marine ecosystems and how they affect organisms at different levels of the food web. You and your crewmates became unwitting test subjects in this research, living examples of how human beings respond to exposure to weapons, grade radioactive fallout. Your medical records, your symptoms, your treatments, and ultimately your death contributed to scientific knowledge about radiation effects that would inform medical practice, environmental policy, and nuclear weapons development for decades to come. The irony is that this knowledge came at the cost of your life, and the health of 22 other men who had never chosen to participate in nuclear research. You were fishermen, not soldiers or scientists or volunteers. You were simply in the wrong place when someone else decided to test a weapon that was too powerful for them to fully control or understand. The Castle Bravo test stands as one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, not because of the immediate death toll, which was relatively small, but because of the way it demonstrated the impossibility of conducting safe nuclear weapons testing. The boundaries between testing zones and inhabited areas proved to be meaningless when dealing with weapons whose effects could spread across hundreds or thousands of miles. Your story, Akichi Kobayama, has become a symbol of the human cost of nuclear weapons development. You represent all the innocent bystanders who have been harmed by nuclear testing, from the original inhabitants of Bikini Atoll, who were displaced from their homes, to the downwind populations in Nevada and other testing areas who were exposed to fallout from atmospheric tests. In the decades since your death, the world has conducted more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests, most of them underground to reduce fallout risks. But each test has added to the cumulative knowledge of nuclear weapons effects, and much of that knowledge has been purchased with human suffering and environmental damage. The ultimate legacy of the Lucky Dragon incident may be its contribution to the growing international consensus that atmospheric nuclear testing is too dangerous to continue. Your death and the contamination of your crewmates helped build public and political support for the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. That treaty didn't end nuclear weapons development, but it did move most testing underground, where fallout risks could be better contained. It represented a recognition that the global environment is too interconnected and too fragile to serve as a testing ground for weapons of mass destruction. The scientific legacy of Castle Bravo extends beyond its immediate victims to influence radiation protection standards, environmental monitoring systems, and medical treatments for radiation exposure. The data collected from you and your fellow crew members has informed radiation safety regulations, the worker protection standards, and emergency response procedures that have protected countless other people from radiation hazards. But this scientific value doesn't diminish the tragedy of your experience or the injustice of your situation. You didn't volunteer to advance radiation medicine or environmental science. You didn't consent to serve as a test subject for studying acute radiation syndrome. You were simply trying to make a living as a fisherman when you became an unwilling casualty of the nuclear age. The story of the Lucky Dragon serves as a reminder that scientific and technological progress often comes with hidden costs that are borne by people who never chose to pay them. The development of nuclear weapons has created knowledge and capabilities that have both military and civilian applications, but the research and testing process has also caused suffering and death among people who derived no benefit from these advances. In the end, your legacy is not just as a victim of nuclear testing, but as a symbol of the need for greater responsibility and accountability in the development and testing of dangerous technologies. Your death helped establish principles of informed consent, environmental protection, and international cooperation that continue to influence nuclear policy and scientific research today. The white snow that fell on the Lucky Dragon's deck on March 1, 1954, was more than just radioactive fallout. It was a warning about the dangers of unleashing forces beyond our ability to fully control or contain. It was a demonstration that in the nuclear age, there are no distant targets and no safe distances when dealing with weapons of mass destruction. Your story, Aikichi Kuboyama, reminds us that behind every nuclear test, every weapons program, every strategic calculation, there are real human beings who can be affected by decisions made by people they've never met, in places they've never been, for reasons they may never understand. You went to sea to catch fish and caught history instead, becoming an unwilling participant in humanity's ongoing experiment with its own capacity for self-destruction. The Lucky Dragon number 5 turned out to be unlucky indeed, but perhaps its greatest misfortune was that it provided the world with a preview of what nuclear warfare might look like: invisible poison falling from clear skies, contaminating everything it touches, killing slowly and quietly while the world goes about its business. It was a glimpse of a future that humanity is still trying to avoid. More than 70 years after the first atomic bomb was detonated, and nearly 70 years after you died from radiation poisoning in a Tokyo hospital. The snow has stopped falling now, but the lesson remains: when you split atoms for weapons, the consequences spread far beyond your intentions, your calculations, and your control. They spread like ripples on a pond, like fallout on the wind, like radioactive isotopes through a food chain, affecting people and places and futures that you never planned to touch. The Lucky Dragon and her crew learned this lesson the hard way, and their experience continues to teach it to anyone willing to listen to the story of what happens when fishermen sail into the fallout of someone else's doomsday. But there's more to this story than just the immediate victims and the obvious consequences. There are the ripple effects that continue for decades, the secondary casualties who never knew they were at risk, and the ways that a single nuclear test can reshape entire societies and cultures. Consider the fish markets of Japan in the months following Castle Bravo. Vendors who had been selling tuna for generations suddenly found themselves in possession of radioactive merchandise that could kill their customers. Market inspectors arrived with Geiger counters, clicking devices that turned the simple act of buying fish into a scene from a science fiction movie. The sound of those counters clicking became associated with danger, contamination, and death. Fish that had been caught weeks before the test were suddenly suspect. How do you prove that a tuna was caught before March 1st, 1954? How do you demonstrate that a fishing vessel was nowhere near the fallout zone when radioactive particles were drifting across hundreds of miles of ocean? The burden of proof fell on the fishermen and vendors, who had to document their activities in ways they had never needed to before. Entire shipments of fish were destroyed as a precautionary measure, not because they were definitely contaminated, but because they might be contaminated, and might be, was enough to make them unmarketable. The economic losses rippled through fishing communities, processing plants, transportation companies, and retail markets. Jobs were lost, businesses failed, and fishing families found themselves unable to make a living in an industry that had supported them for generations. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Fishing is not just an occupation in Japan, it's a cultural identity, a way of life that connects people to the sea, and to their ancestors who also made their living from the ocean. When that connection becomes associated with invisible danger and potential death, it changes the fundamental relationship between humans and the natural world they depend on. Children in fishing families grew up hearing stories about the day the ocean became poisonous. They learned to be afraid of the sea in ways their grandparents never had to be. The ocean had always been dangerous. Storms, equipment failures, and accidents were part of the fishing life, but these were visible, immediate dangers that could be understood and managed. Radiation was different. It was invisible, undetectable without special equipment, and capable of killing you slowly over months or years. Some fishing communities turned away from the sea altogether, abandoning traditional livelihoods for work on land. Others continued fishing but with a new wariness, a constant awareness that the ocean they depended on might also be the source of their destruction. The relationship between humans and the sea, which had existed for thousands of years, was fundamentally altered by a single nuclear test conducted by a foreign government thousands of miles away. The international fishing industry also felt the effects. Countries that imported Japanese fish began implementing their own radiation testing programs. Trade relationships that had been based on trust and tradition suddenly required scientific verification and government certification. The simple act of selling fish across national boundaries became complicated by radiation detection equipment, testing protocols, and safety standards. Insurance companies, faced with claims for radioactive contamination, began to understand that nuclear risks were unlike any other hazards they had previously covered. Traditional insurance models assume that disasters are localized and temporary. A fire burns out, a storm passes, an earthquake stops shaking. But radioactive contamination can persist for decades and spread across continents. It represents a new category of risk that challenges fundamental assumptions about how insurance should work. The legal implications were equally complex. Who is liable when a nuclear test in one country contaminates fish caught by another country's fishing fleet? What compensation is appropriate for fishermen who lose their health, their livelihood, and potentially their lives as a result of someone else's weapons testing? How do you calculate damages for radiation exposure that might cause cancer years or decades later? These questions had never been addressed before because nuclear weapons testing was a new phenomenon. The legal frameworks that existed in 1954 were designed for conventional disputes between nations, not for dealing with the global environmental consequences of weapons of mass destruction. The Lucky Dragon incident forced the international community to begin developing new legal and diplomatic mechanisms for addressing nuclear-related damages. The scientific community was also transformed by the Castle Bravo disaster. Researchers who had previously focused on the physics of nuclear reactions suddenly found themselves studying the biological effects of radiation exposure. Medical professionals who had trained to treat conventional injuries had to learn how to diagnose and treat radiation poisoning. Environmental scientists discovered that they needed to understand how radioactive isotopes move through ecosystems and accumulate in food chains. New scientific disciplines emerged from the need to understand and manage nuclear risks. Health physics, radiation biology, and environmental radiochemistry became established fields of study. Universities began offering degrees in radiation protection and nuclear safety. Government agencies created new departments focused on nuclear emergency response and environmental monitoring. The technology for detecting and measuring radiation also advanced rapidly. Gauge counters became more sensitive and portable. New instruments were developed to measure specific radioactive isotopes in food, water, and air. Environmental monitoring networks were established to track the global distribution of radioactive fallout from nuclear tests. These technological advances had applications beyond nuclear weapons testing. The same techniques used to detect radioactive contamination in fish could be used to monitor radiation levels in nuclear power plants, medical facilities, and research laboratories. The medical knowledge gained from treating radiation exposure victims improved cancer therapy and diagnostic imaging. The environmental monitoring systems developed to track nuclear fallout proved useful for studying other forms of pollution and environmental change. But these beneficial applications came at a terrible cost. The scientific and technological progress was built on human suffering and environmental damage. Every advance in radiation medicine was informed by studying victims of nuclear accidents and weapons tests. Every improvement in environmental monitoring was motivated by the need to track contamination that should never have existed in the first place. The Castle Bravo incident also revealed the limitations of scientific knowledge and the dangers of technological hubris. The scientists and engineers who designed the test were among the most brilliant minds of their generation. They had extensive experience with nuclear weapons and access to sophisticated computational tools. Yet they miscalculated the weapon's yield by a factor of 3, demonstrating that even experts can be catastrophically wrong when dealing with complex systems. This realization led to greater humility within the scientific community and increased emphasis on safety margins, redundant testing, and peer review processes. Scientists began to acknowledge that their understanding of nuclear weapons effects was incomplete, and that unexpected consequences were always possible when dealing with such powerful and complex technologies. The military implications of Castle Bravo were equally significant. The test demonstrated that hydrogen bombs could be built with yields far exceeding anything previously achieved. This sparked an arms race as other nuclear powers rushed to develop their own thermonuclear weapons. The Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France all accelerated their nuclear weapons programs in response to the apparent American breakthrough in hydrogen bomb technology. But the incident also revealed the difficulty of controlling nuclear weapons once they're detonated. Military planners had to grapple with the fact that these weapons could cause unintended casualties far from their intended targets. The concept of collateral damage took on new meaning when the damage could include radioactive contamination spreading across international boundaries. Strategic thinking about nuclear warfare had to incorporate these new realities. War planners could no longer assume that nuclear weapons would affect only enemy territories. Fallout patterns, wind directions, and atmospheric conditions became military considerations. The possibility of accidentally contaminating friendly nations or neutral countries had to be factored into targeting decisions and weapons deployment strategies. The Lucky Dragon incident demonstrated that nuclear weapons are inherently different from conventional weapons in their potential for causing uncontrolled and unpredictable effects. This realization influenced military doctrine, arms control negotiations, and strategic planning for decades to come. It contributed to the development of concepts like nuclear winter and mutual assured destruction that recognized the global and potentially civilization-ending consequences of nuclear warfare. The political ramifications extended far beyond US-Japan relations. Other nations began to question whether they could trust nuclear powers to conduct weapons testing safely. If the United States, with its advanced technology and extensive experience, could accidentally irradiate foreign nationals, what might happen if less experienced or less careful nations developed nuclear weapons? This concern contributed to international efforts to limit nuclear weapons proliferation and to establish stronger safety standards for nuclear testing. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1968 was partly motivated by fears that widespread nuclear weapons development would lead to more accidents like Castle Bravo. The treaty recognized that nuclear weapons posed risks not just to potential enemies, but to anyone who might be affected by testing accidents or proliferation to unstable governments. The incident also influenced public opinion about nuclear weapons and nuclear energy more generally. Anti-nuclear movements gained momentum as people began to understand that nuclear technologies posed risks even when they were used for supposedly peaceful purposes like testing or research. The images of sick fishermen and contaminated fish made the abstract concept of radiation hazards concrete and personal for ordinary citizens. Environmental movements also drew lessons from Castle Bravo about the global nature of environmental threats. The fact that a nuclear test in the Pacific could contaminate fish eaten in Japan demonstrated that national boundaries were meaningless when dealing with certain kinds of pollution. This understanding influenced later environmental campaigns on issues like acid rain, ozone depletion, and climate change. The Lucky Dragon incident became a symbol for environmental activists who argued that industrial and military activities could have unintended consequences far from where they occurred. The image of radioactive snow falling from a clear sky became a metaphor for invisible environmental threats that could affect anyone, anywhere, regardless of their involvement in or knowledge of the activities that created the danger. Educational systems also responded to the incident by incorporating radiation safety and environmental science into their curricula. Students began learning about radioactive isotopes, biological effects of radiation, and environmental contamination as part of basic science education. The Lucky Dragon story became a case study used in schools to teach about the unintended consequences of technological development and the importance of considering environmental and human health effects when developing new technologies. Medical schools added radiation medicine to their curricula, and nursing schools began training students to care for radiation exposure victims. Emergency response agencies developed new protocols for dealing with nuclear accidents and radiation emergencies. The entire healthcare system had to adapt to address a new category of injuries and illnesses that had barely existed before the nuclear age. The fishing industry itself was transformed by the need to address contamination risks. New technologies were developed for testing fish for radioactive contamination. Supply chain management systems were created to track the origin and safety of seafood products. Industry associations established certification programs to verify that fish were caught in safe areas and properly tested for contamination. Fishing vessel design also evolved to incorporate radiation detection equipment and improved communication systems that would allow boats to receive warnings about contaminated areas. Navigation systems were enhanced to help vessels avoid areas where nuclear testing was taking place. The simple wooden fishing boats of earlier generations gave way to more sophisticated vessels equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction to fishermen of previous eras. The economic structure of the fishing industry changed as well. Insurance became more expensive and more complicated as companies tried to assess and price nuclear-related risks. fishing cooperatives and companies had to set aside reserves for potential contamination incidents. The cost of doing business increased significantly as the industry had to account for risks that had never existed before. International trade in seafood became subject to new regulations and testing requirements. Import and export procedures were complicated by the need to verify that products were safe for consumption. Trade disputes arose when countries disagreed about acceptable radiation levels in food products. The global seafood market, which had operated relatively freely for centuries, became subject to scientific testing, government regulation, and international negotiation. The Castle Bravo incident also influenced the development of international law regarding environmental damage and transboundary pollution. Legal scholars and diplomats had to develop new concepts and procedures for addressing situations where activities in one country caused environmental harm in other countries. The principles of state responsibility, compensation for environmental damage, and international environmental cooperation that emerged from these efforts continue to influence international law today. The incident contributed to the development of the concept of common heritage of mankind. In international law, recognizing that certain areas and resources, like the oceans and the atmosphere, belong to all humanity and should be protected from damage by any individual nation. This concept later influenced treaties on ocean pollution, climate change, and the use of outer space. The role of international organizations in addressing nuclear risks also evolved in response to Castle Bravo. The International Atomic Energy Agency, established in 1957, was partly motivated by the need for international oversight of nuclear activities to prevent accidents and reduce proliferation risks. The agency's safety standards, inspection procedures, and emergency response protocols were informed by lessons learned from nuclear testing accidents and their consequences. Regional organizations also developed new capabilities for addressing nuclear emergencies. In the Pacific, organizations were created to monitor radiation levels in the ocean and coordinate responses to nuclear accidents. These organizations served as models for similar institutions in other regions and helped establish international cooperation as a standard approach to managing nuclear risks. The scientific understanding of radiation effects on marine ecosystems continued to evolve for decades after Castle Bravo. Long-term studies of fish populations in the Pacific revealed complex patterns of contamination, adaptation, and recovery. Some species showed remarkable resilience to radiation exposure, while others experienced lasting genetic changes that affected their populations for generations. Marine biology as a field was transformed by the need to understand how radioactive isotopes move through ocean food webs. New research methods were developed to track contamination pathways and measure the biological effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure. The data collected from these studies informed radiation protection standards and environmental remediation efforts worldwide. The coral reefs around Bikini Atoll became natural laboratories for studying ecosystem recovery from nuclear damage. Scientists documented the slow process of recolonization and the emergence of new ecological relationships in the devastated areas. These studies provided insights into ecosystem resilience and recovery that proved valuable for understanding environmental restoration in other contexts. The atmospheric effects of Castle Bravo also continue to be studied, and refined understanding of how nuclear explosions interact with weather patterns and climate systems. The massive injection of energy and particles into the atmosphere affected weather patterns across the Pacific for months after the test. Meteorologists had to develop new models to account for the atmospheric effects of nuclear explosions, knowledge that proved important for understanding the potential climate effects of nuclear warfare. The cultural impact of the Lucky Dragon incident extended far beyond Japan. The story became part of the global narrative about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need for international cooperation to prevent nuclear conflicts. Literature, films, and other cultural works drew on the imagery and themes of the incident to explore questions about technology, progress, and human responsibility. In Japan, the incident reinforced cultural memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and contributed to the development of a strong anti-nuclear movement. The country's unique experience as the only nation to suffer nuclear attacks, combined with the Lucky Dragon incident, created a cultural aversion to nuclear weapons that continues to influence Japanese politics and foreign policy today. The incident also influenced Japanese attitudes toward nuclear energy. Despite the country's limited natural energy resources, public skepticism about nuclear technology made it difficult to develop nuclear power programs. When Japan did eventually build nuclear power plants, the memory of the Lucky Dragon incident contributed to particularly strict safety standards and extensive public consultation processes. Art and literature in Japan and other countries incorporated themes and imagery from the Castle Bravo incident. The image of radioactive snow falling from a clear sky became a powerful metaphor for invisible threats and unintended consequences. Writers and artists used the story of the fisherman to explore themes of innocence destroyed by forces beyond individual control, the hubris of scientific and military power, and the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Educational materials developed to teach about nuclear weapons and radiation often used the Lucky Dragon incident as a case study. The story was accessible and human in ways that abstract discussions of nuclear physics and radiation biology were not. Students could understand the experience of fishermen caught in radioactive fallout, even if they couldn't fully grasp the scientific principles underlying nuclear weapons. The incident also influenced public health approaches to radiation protection. Health authorities developed new guidelines for responding to radiation emergencies, screening protocols for radiation exposure, and public education programs about radiation risks. The medical knowledge gained from treating the Lucky Dragon crew informed these efforts and helped establish radiation medicine as a medical specialty. Decades later, as new nuclear technologies emerged and new nuclear risks developed, the lessons of Castle Bravo continued to be relevant. The accident at 3 Mile Island in 1979, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, and the Fukushima accident in 2011 all drew on knowledge and experience that could be traced back to the early nuclear testing accidents like Castle Bravo. Each incident added to the cumulative understanding of nuclear risks and the importance of safety systems, emergency planning, and international cooperation. The Lucky Dragon incident ultimately stands as a watershed moment in humanity's relationship with nuclear technology. It marked the end of the period when nuclear weapons could be tested with confidence that their effects could be contained and predicted. It demonstrated that nuclear technologies pose risks not just to intended targets, but to anyone who might be affected by unintended consequences. Your story, Akichi Kuboyama, became part of this larger historical narrative about the nuclear age and its human costs. You represent not just the specific tragedy of 23 fishermen caught in radioactive fallout, but the broader phenomenon of ordinary people becoming casualties of extraordinary weapons. Your death marked a moment when the abstract concept of nuclear warfare became personal and immediate for people around the world. The radioactive snow that killed you continues to fall, metaphorically speaking. Whenever nuclear weapons are tested, nuclear materials are transported, or nuclear facilities operate, the risk of unintended exposure, accidental contamination, and uncontrolled consequences remains part of the nuclear age. Your story serves as a reminder that these risks are not just theoretical possibilities, but real dangers that can affect real people in unexpected ways. The Lucky Dragon No. 5 sails on in memory and history, a ghost ship carrying its cargo of lessons about nuclear weapons, human vulnerability, and the unintended consequences of technological progress. The luck that gave the vessel its name ran out in the radioactive snow of March 1954. But the legacy of that unlucky voyage continues to inform our understanding of nuclear risks and our efforts to prevent future nuclear tragedies.